It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, June 28th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. The United States of America had a presidential debate. There have been riots in Kenya over a tax bill. There has been an attempted coup in Bolivia, and a very promising inflation report kind of snuck in under the radar today. We'll start there, Sam Park. An important economic measure for the Federal Reserve, this is from CNBC, showed Friday today that inflation during May slowed to its lowest annual rate in more than 3 years. The core personal consumption expenditures price index, boy, that's catchy, was up just 2.6% from a year ago. Now, 2% is the target. So 2.6% is close to the target. And that's the best it's been in 3 years. That's pretty impressive.
Yes, I mean, normally that would be very good news for President Biden. But today, I don't think anyone even is going to be paying much attention to it, unfortunately.
Okay, I do want to talk about Kenya and Bolivia because those are fascinating stories, but and this is not a politics podcast. However, the incumbent United States president had a politically disastrous showing during a presidential debate last night. And his candidate and his opponent is, of course, Donald Trump, who is essentially an anti-democratic candidate. So the greatest superpower in the world, facing the greatest strain on the Pax Americana in decades, has an incumbent president who is politically wounded. And I know that has big implications for every other country on earth. And so I want to start there.
Okay, fine. Now, like here on Working for Crusoe, sort of similarly to the Federal Reserve, we have what we might call a dual mandate, right? We talk about economics and foreign affairs. And last week, when we were previewing last night's debate, we said, and assuring our listeners, that we would discuss last night's debate to the extent that it involved substantive discussion of those two topics. And we got very little of that. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that President Biden had a great deal of difficulty expressing himself. For instance, the very first question he got, which I think was the low point of his debate performance, he barely managed, I would say, to defend his own economic record, even in the most general terms. And so we might ourselves throw about facts and figures about how the economy is done or not done under President Biden. But that was his job to do last night, and he didn't really do it very well. Donald Trump, for his part, as he often does, just told lie after lie after lie after lie. However, he did here and there say things that were true or at least plausible. And one of the things he said was that, of course, America has been adding lots and lots of jobs because once the pandemic ended, it was going to do that anyway. Now, of course, that sounds plausible, and I think that is to some extent true. If Biden had been on his game, he might have come back and said, well, look, the pandemic ended everywhere.
Right.
Why is our country doing so much better than other countries, even on things like inflation? I'll tell you why. It's because of the policies of my administration. But Biden didn't do that.
Or worse, Sam was incapable of doing that.
That's right. And it was his job to connect those dots for the people watching at home. And he didn't quite get there. He seemed to want to, but couldn't quite come up with it. And that's his failing. Then, of course, Trump also said, to turn to foreign policy, that if he'd still been president, then Russia would not have invaded Ukraine and Hamas would not have attacked Israel. Now, of course, mendacious people like Donald Trump really enjoy bringing out these sorts of arguments because they can be neither proven nor disproven,
Right.
right? And so it's in fact not an argument at all. So there can be no counter argument. Again, Biden could have countered with that and said, you have no way of knowing if that's true, right? That's entirely speculative and entirely superficial. But he couldn't do that either. But as far as I can tell, that was almost the extent of the substantive discussion of economics and foreign policy in last night's 90-minute debate. Just those two things. Here and there, maybe they touched on something, but mainly what they were both trying to do was say, my policy good, his policy bad. And that's about it, right? They didn't explain why. For instance, Biden talked about the letter from 16 Nobel Prize winning economists that came out on Wednesday saying that the policies that Trump was proposing would make inflation much worse and almost certainly lead to a recession. Biden did mention that, but he didn't say why he thought that was true. Again, it was his job to connect the dots, but he did not do that. But as you say, John, the reason these are important issues is because of an issue that we do discuss frequently on this show, which is American global leadership. And Trump said something that, while not exactly true, is, I would say, sort of truth adjacent. And he said it numerous times, which is that people in other countries wonder what happened to the United States. I think that actually is true, although that's mainly Trump's own fault. That's my opinion, but I'm sticking to it. However, last night's debate at least could have been viewed by probably more people around the world, including, as we often say, in the global South, just on their phones. I would say billions of people at least had the opportunity to watch all of it. And President Biden, along with many other American politicians, often like to talk about defending American democracy and holding up American democracy as an example for the rest of the world to follow. And I think any one of those billions of people that could have watched last night's debate, some of them might have a very sophisticated understanding of American politics. Others might not know much about it at all. But regardless of their specific level of knowledge, any one of these people could have just watched last night's so-called debate and said to themselves, you know what? If that's American democracy, America can have it. Okay, fine. Maybe there's not some other country whose system I think is a lot better, but is this really the example we're supposed to follow? I could forgive anybody who looked at that debate and said no.
This cuts to a core issue that we talk about on this program. And I think, you and I are of slightly different mind about it. I'm a bit make American global leadership great again. And you're of the opinion that the time has passed and stop reaching for it. Or I don't mean to mischaracterize your opinion about it, but I feel like I am more nostalgic or more enthusiastic about continued American global leadership than you are. Is that fair?
Yes, but I would just say that it needs to be recalibrated.
Well,
right?
Certainly when that's what we're putting out there, it does.
No, but it's not just that. It's a question of the changing demographic profile of the world. All right. America is still an enormous superpower. Think about it this way, John. For instance, 100, 200 years ago, the Great Britain was almost certainly the most powerful nation on earth, and they stopped being that. They couldn't sustain their empire. Right now, I would say that the United States, the nature of American hegemony is a bit different from the way British hegemony worked under their empire.
Certainly.
But the point is that Britain is still a very prosperous country today, although maybe not as much as they would like to be, as we'll talk about next week. But people still want to immigrate to Britain in very large numbers, just as they do here. So when people in this country say, oh, well, if America's in so much decline, why are so many people trying to come here? Well, it's not really that simple. Okay. Sure. And I don't think actually that the United States is facing the same sort of decline as Britain did at the end of their empire. But the point is that in a relative sense, there's just no way that American influence across the globe can be maintained at the level it was just a few decades ago. And we ought not be seen to attempt to try to maintain it at that level. It just can't happen. If we're going to try to do that, we're going to be seen to be looked to as
it's buffoonish,
at least foolish, if not outright power hungry.
That's fair. That's fair. And I'm not suggesting that we return to some sort of like Reagan-like posture, although given the current state of the world, I feel, this is my opinion, I feel like if the United States, since the disastrous Iraq war, had been engaged in less bad decision-making foreign policy-wise, we wouldn't be in the quasi-crisis we are now. I can't say specifically about Hamas, but certainly Russia, certainly China, right? These guys have been waiting and poking at American. They've been waiting for the United States to look and act vulnerable or at least disorganized. And now they have the opportunity. And that, I think, from the foreign policy paradigm, from the global leadership paradigm, which is both economic and diplomatic, that's what's so disconcerting about last night, is that you're right. Maybe this isn't the country that should be projecting that kind of leadership across the globe, if that's what we're putting forward. And to me, that's just tragic, because the Pax Americana, I'm for it. And, okay. and if we can't muster the kind of leadership to make people believe in it, that's a problem for the world.
Well, if we can't, it's our own fault. Because people assumed in this country that our sole superpower status would just naturally sustain itself. That was folly. All right. Again, just because of demographics, which should not have come to a surprise to anybody.
I totally understand that. Yeah.
But no, we had to say, oh, it's the end of history and all this garbage. Okay. I don't, it's our own fault if that's the way it is. Yeah. And again, nobody is going to go back to anything.
Right.
And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems, is that on both sides of our partisan political divide, people seem to think that there was some prior state to which we should want to revert. Right. And I think it's just foolishness. So, John, if you're nostalgic, that's on you.
No, you may have convinced me that's not the right way to phrase it, because I'm not. I agree with you. Looking back is invariably, first of all, it's inaccurate, right? Yeah. But second of all, it's the death throes of a power.
Well, yeah, we should only want to go forward.
Yes.
Right. If we want to call ourselves progressives, yep. What does that even mean? It literally means to go forward.
Right. John Kennedy wasn't running on the old frontier.
No.
All right. We'll continue our discussion about the presidential debate, not on this podcast, but I did think it was sufficiently catastrophic for the democracy candidate. And we'll talk about how this affects NATO and how Putin wants to prosecute his illegal war in future episodes.
Okay, sure. But let's also just not pretend that this is only about our country. When we were discussing the European parliamentary elections last week, and we'll be discussing the French elections coming up. So this same sort of issue is at play in other places also.
That's right. France with the first round of voting coming up in 2 days. So we'll check that next week. Okay. Kenya. This is reporting from the BBC. Kenya's High Court has approved the use of military force to restore order following days of anti-tax protests that at some point overwhelmed police. More than 20 people have been reportedly killed in nationwide protests, largely led by young people opposed to government plans to increase taxes. Before we go any further, Kenya, 51 million people, 66th biggest economy in the world. The capital is Nairobi. The president, William Ruto, has been in power for 2 years, and this was a tax bill to help deal with a serious debt crisis. And the people have said no.
Yes.
The debt burden is like 70% or something crazy of expenditures, right? It is a crisis that needs to be addressed, but the people have said not like this.
That's right. And I think it's worth examining why they said that. For example, many of the taxes that were proposed were incredibly regressive. They're the sales taxes on things like diapers, bread, and menstrual products. Just, I don't know whose idea this was. But of course, as president, Ruto bears responsibility, and he handled this all extremely badly. For instance, when the unrest began last week, he said that the protesters were treasonous. And I think that's one of the reasons why the military crackdown was so onerous and just terribly mismanaged. And I think it's worth looking also at the profile of the people protesting. As you say, it's overwhelmingly young people. And like many countries in Africa, Kenya has a very, very young population. And as we were saying in our last segment, these people are highly connected. They're very online. They're very mobile phone native. And in some ways, we might think that this was partly how the protests were organized. And in fact, Kenya, like many countries, has a history of political violence. But this is different, right? Almost always in previous episodes of political violence in Kenya, it's intertribal. This is something entirely new in Kenyan history, and it is a pan-tribal, leaderless, as far as we can tell, youth movement. And I think that's another reason why it's proved so difficult for Ruto to deal with. So just to review, he has supposedly withdrawn the tax bill, although there's some debate as to how under the Constitution, he can go about doing that. There are various parliamentary procedures that need to be followed, and no one seems to know exactly how that's going to happen. But he's not pursuing the bill. He's promised to meet and consult with protest leaders, but no one actually knows who they are. And so this is very hard for Ruto to manage, and there's some question as to whether he can even survive as president. And this touches on the sort of global influence topic that we often address, in that Ruto is very close to Western powers. For example, at the same time that protesters were being killed in the streets of Nairobi, and by the way, in other places too that we haven't seen reporting on, Ruto, that is, was waving goodbye to the Haitian, that is the Kenyan police forces that are going to be taking over policing in Haiti, which is very much Ruto trying to, be a valued member of the Western-led international community. And good for him. I think that, we should all be very happy that he chose to deploy his forces in this manner. But if Ruto falls because of these protests, no one knows what's going to happen. And as you say, a lot of this, the reason for this tax bill is because of the crippling debt burden, some of which is owed to people like the IMF and the standard sort of international institutions. Some of it, however, also is owed to China. And China has been sort of reluctant to extend any sort of debt relief to many nations around the world who have had very large problems dealing with their debt, especially since the pandemic. Now, I think that some of the criticisms of China or the accusations leveled against them by Westerners that they're trying to ensnare poor countries in a debt trap, right? I think a lot of this is overblown, right? There's very little evidence of them actually doing that. It's certainly a danger, but they haven't actually done a whole lot of it. It's just that they're sort of, or I believe anyway, that they're sort of newcomers to the international lending arena. And so it seemed to have surprised them. It's like, what do you mean you can't pay your debt? Right? As if they didn't know that this was something that happens, especially after a global crisis like a pandemic. I think part of it might also be that their own economy isn't doing so well right now. So part of it is simply going, hey man, we need that money, you know? And so this is a problem. But I think, and I'm very confident in two things. One is that one reason that Ruto withdrew the bill was because he was getting calls from people saying, okay, look, we know we wanted you to raise taxes, but maybe don't do this because we can't have your country in a big mess. That's not going to help anybody. And I think Ruto might himself judge that he can go to the IMF and to China, by the way, and say, okay, you've seen what's happening here. Okay, you've got to give us a break, right? We're going to need more time to work this out because if my country goes down, this is not going to help us repay our debt. So you need to extend us some. And I think China might be amenable to that, especially because one of the reasons they've extended so much debt is so that they can gain influence amongst these poorer countries.
It's interesting you mentioned that China new to the game. Like, wasn't there was the big debt relief campaign around the turn of the millennium from, I think it was the IMF,
Yes.
But towards the developing or what we now refer to as the global South.
Yes. Also the World Bank.
Yes. Yeah, the World Bank, and also and that's over like 2 centuries of colonialism and then post-colonialism and exploitative economic stance by the West. Whereas, yeah, China is learning the hard lessons in real time.
Yes, that's right. And now just to review, the IMF generally takes care of crisis intervention, whereas the World Bank lands mainly for development aid. But of course, in poor countries, those are two broadly overlapping categories, right? For instance, when we discussed the sort of inter-Cold War period in Russia, there was a joint relief package put together by both the World Bank and the IMF. And that's certainly not the only time that's happened.
You mentioned the crackdown. So there was initially tear gas deployed against the protesters, but then live ammunition. And we've seen reports of as many as 23 killed. We don't know if that's all from Kenyan military, the killing done, but certainly chaos and deadly violence. William Ruto addressed the media after the initial kind of protest and storming of the Capitol and setting of fires. He said that he later characterized, and this was in the Al Jazeera report you sent me, that a peaceful protest had been infiltrated and then hijacked by a criminal element. So I thought that was at least an attempt at making a somewhat sophisticated political maneuver against a decentralized, organized over social media protest movement, which is to say, most of you are good people. I know most of you didn't storm the Capitol nor deserve to get shot and killed, and most of you didn't set a fire.
Well, there's also widespread looting, by the way.
So he's right. So he's trying to kind of get right. He's trying to get back on side with at least some politically viable component of this protest movement.
Well, yeah, and also withdrawing the tax bill has reduced the numbers of protesters, but it hasn't stopped them. They are still ongoing, and there are still clashes happening in Nairobi and all over the country. And I think that bears some emphasis here. This is not just in the capital. It's all over a very large country. And, people in Kenya, they're so angry. If you look at any of the television footage of this, people are just livid about this. And they're all very young, but they're very eloquent about what they're facing. They talk about the farming crisis. For example, Kenya is not a nation of the Sahel, which we often talk about, but you know what? It's on the equator. Now, I don't know enough about Kenyan geography to say exactly how climate change is affecting Kenya. I feel pretty confident in saying that not well. Right. If you're on the equator, I think you're in kind of a lot of trouble due to climate change.
Can we move on to Bolivia, or do you have any other thoughts about Kenya?
No, but I mean, well, Kenya is something we're going to have to keep looking at in future weeks, just because this is an ongoing situation. We don't know exactly how the tax bill is going to shake out and what's going to replace it, what sort of negotiations Ruto can achieve with China and or the IMF. So that we're going to have to keep an eye on this in future episodes.
Okay, Dateline La Paz, Bolivia. This is reporting from the Associated Press. Led by a top general vowing to, quote, restore democracy, armored vehicles rammed the doors of Bolivia's government palace Wednesday, 2 days ago, in what the president of Bolivia called a coup attempt. But then the armored vehicles quickly retreated. This is the latest crisis in Bolivia that is also ensnared in an economic crisis. All right, so Bolivia, 12 million people, 96th biggest economy in the world. It's a landlocked country in Western Central South America. We'll throw the map up. I did not know this until I read up on Bolivia. The administrative capital, La Paz, that contains the executive, legislative, and electoral branches of the government, but the constitutional capital is Sucre, which is the seat of the judiciary. So kind of interesting how they break that up.
It is interesting.
And maybe makes it coup. It's an attempt at coup proofing, because let's face it, this is, you got to be ready. You got to be ready for a coup in South America.
If that's why they did it, it didn't work, because I saw one Bolivian commentator on television yesterday saying that, in fact, Bolivia has had more coups than any other South American country. And South America is not
it's coup country.
Yeah, it's not a continent that's exactly free of coups. Or there's no shortage of coups there, let's say.
I have to say,
beaucoup de coups, we might say.
Very nice, Sam. I think with some regret, this is the first time we have even discussed Bolivia on Working for Crusoe. So a rather ignominious entry into the ledger.
Yes, unfortunately. Well, that's usually the way it goes, unfortunately, right?
The soldiers' retreat after their attempted coup was followed by the arrest of Army Chief General Juan Jose Zuniga after the Bolivian Attorney General opened an investigation. I mean, look, is a coup in South America just dog bites man?
Okay, this is
I'm teasing.
A much more involved story than it seemed at first blush.
Sure.
Okay, apparently the reason for the coup was because first General Zuniga came out and said that he leveled some criticism at the former Bolivian president, Evo Morales, who is widely believed to want to return to power, and in fact was deposed in a coup for trying to cling to power for an additional presidential term. This didn't work out for Morales. There was a caretaker right-wing government, and then the current president, a former protege of Evo Morales, by the way, Luis Arce, took over and has been running Bolivia ever since. And so now, of course, in our country, generals don't criticize political leaders, right? Now, this is more common in other places, but it's still frowned upon in any kind of, at least, aspirationally democratic regime, right? And so Luis Arce, the president, fired General Zuniga. He said, saying essentially, you can't do this. You have to stay out of politics. You're just a general, right? And I would say that's an eminently reasonable thing to do, right? And that apparently was the reason that General Zuniga launched this coup attempt, which failed almost instantly. The problem is that there's known to be some animosity between Evo Morales and his successor and one-time protege, President Arce, who, now that he's president, he doesn't want Morales to come back into the presidency. And so General Zuniga says that this was all a hoax, right? That President Arce asked him to attempt a coup.
A false flag coup?
Yes, so that Arce could emerge as the protector of Bolivian democracy, and and thereby sort of boost his own standing against Evo Morales. Now, it's not so much that he said, "Would you do a coup?" Right, as he sort of goaded him into criticizing Evo, and then fired him from his job at the head of the military.
Got it.
Right? I guess assuming that he would then launch a coup. It's again, this is not all the details of this are not clear to me, and they seem a little bit implausible. But on the other hand, this coup ended almost as soon as it had begun. Right? He launched it. President Arce replaced General Zuniga with someone else, and then admirably, the people of La Paz took to the streets right in the neighborhood of the presidential palace. And there was a televised confrontation between Arce and General Zuniga in the lobby of the presidential palace, in which he said, "You are not welcome here. You cannot do this. This is a democracy, blah, blah, blah." All on television.
Magnificent.
Right? The troops withdrew under, being pushed aside on the street by ordinary civilians. And then in a very sort of resonant, I would say, gesture, President Arce took to the balcony of the presidential palace and addressed the crowd, holding the flag in his arms and thanking them for helping him defend democracy. Now, I don't know much about Luis Arce, okay? He seems to be a rather unprepossessing figure, and I wouldn't pick him out as some sort of Machiavellian political operator, but that doesn't mean he isn't one. And so I don't know if General Zuniga's story is actually correct. Again, it seems implausible.
Far-fetched.
Yeah, but there's questions that people have about this. And the whole thing does seem a bit odd, but it was certainly a gripping day or so of drama in La Paz. And so in both the cases of Bolivia and Kenya, a lot of this is just people on the street. Without that, none of these stories would have happened. Now, there's this sort of maneuvering with the IMF or with General Zuniga and President Arce or this or that, but without the people on the street.
Pissed off people.
Yeah, these are not stories, okay? Or at least nothing like to the degree that they are. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. And again, coups in Latin America, like you say, these, it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that is all that remarkable. But there is a kind of postmodern element to this story that we're going to have to tease out a little bit. But to return to Kenya, as I say, this is not the 20th century. This is not an intertribal Kenyan political conflict. This is new today. This is a 21st century phenomenon, unlike the garbage that we had to watch last night in Atlanta. And again, I will say this as many times as I think we have to. This is where the struggle is happening. It's in the global South, and we need to pay attention to that. And our leaders need to pay attention to it also.
Okay. For next week, we have the first round of the French elections coming up on the 30th. That's Sunday. We have, clearly not in celebration of Independence Day, the British election on the 4th of July.
The first and only round.
Yeah, on the 4th of July, which I've had to explain to some American friends. No, they don't acknowledge the 4th of July in Great Britain.
No.
And then the second round of the French elections will be on July 7th. So we'll have snuck in another episode. We are not taking the 4th of July off. We have, we're forging forward. We will have another episode next Friday on the 5th.
In fact, right now, voting has been extended. Voting hours have been extended in the first round of the presidential election in Iran. So we'll be able, and if it goes to a second round, we might have final results by the time of next week's episode. We might not, so we might have to push that off another week also. But that's happening right now in addition.
All right. That'll do it for us. We will be back next Friday, July 5th on Working for Crusoe. He is Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.